You've probably heard of it, the Stanford Prison Experiment. It's one of the most famous and, let's be honest, infamous studies in the history of psychology. For decades, it's been the go-to story for how good people can turn bad. But what if the story we've all been told isn't what really happened?
This right here, this quote from the head researcher Philip Zimbardo is the takeaway that stuck. The big idea was that it's not about a few bad apples. It's about the bad barrel they're put into. It's a simple, pretty terrifying conclusion that's been shaping our view of human nature for over half a century.
Not even close, because when you really start to dig into what went down in that basement at Stanford University, that simple, clean story, it just completely falls apart. And the truth? Well, it's a lot messier, and honestly, in some ways, it's even more disturbing.
So the legend goes something like this. Back in 1971, you take a bunch of perfectly normal, healthy college guys, you randomly make half of them prisoners and the other half guards, and you stick them in a fake prison. Within days, the guards turn into these sadistic monsters, and the prisoners, they become these broken, passive shells of themselves. It got so bad they had to shut the whole thing down early. It was seen as this perfect, chilling example of how a situation can totally corrupt people.
Okay, so let's pull back the curtain and actually look at how this whole thing was built. Because the setup, the very foundation of the study, that's where you start to see the first major cracks.
Now, on the surface, it all looked pretty scientific, right? They put an ad in the paper, they screened the guys to make sure they were psychologically stable, and then, flip of a coin, you're a prisoner or a guard. And to make it feel super real, they had actual police officers go arrest the prisoners at their homes. I mean, they were trying to make this feel incredibly real right from the get-go.
But hang on, let's look at that ad for a second. It specifically asked for people for a study of prison life. Think about it. Who signs up for that? Later studies actually looked into this, and it turns out the kind of person who volunteers for a prison study is more likely to be aggressive and authoritarian to begin with. So were these guys really average? Maybe not so much.
And this might be the biggest problem of all, the fatal flaw. Philip Zimbardo wasn't just some detached scientist in a lab coat observing things. No. He was in the experiment. He was playing the role of the prison superintendent. So you have the lead researcher, who's supposed to be objective, also acting as the boss of the prison. That is a massive conflict of interest. It completely blurs the line between an experiment and, well, a performance.
So you've got a potentially biased group of participants, and you've got a researcher who's also the prison boss. The stage was absolutely set for things to go off the rails. And it didn't just drift into chaos, it was a nosedive. The speed at which everything fell apart was, honestly, it was shocking.
Day one was just awkward. Everyone was just kind of feeling out their roles. But by the morning of day two, the prisoners rebelled. They ripped their numbers off, they barricaded themselves in their cells, and the guards hit back, hard. We're talking spraying them with CO2 fire extinguishers, stripping them naked, putting the leaders in solitary confinement. By day three, the psychological games got intense, making some prisoners clean toilets with their bare hands. Then, on day four, a prisoner just completely breaks down, screaming uncontrollably. This thing was supposed to last 2 weeks. They pulled the plug after just 6 days.
Now, for years and years, the official story was that the guards just made all this stuff up on their own, that their cruelty was spontaneous. The claim was that Zimbardo and his team just gave them one instruction: maintain law and order, and then just sat back and watched what happened.
And you can't deny the impact this had on the participants. This quote from the prisoner who had the breakdown, it's heartbreaking. It shows just how real the psychological damage was. And for a long time, this sheer drama and the very real suffering of these young men made people kind of gloss over the scientific problems. But it's that same suffering that eventually forced a new generation of researchers to say, wait a minute, what was really going on here?
So as people started to look closer, to re-examine the notes, the tapes, the interviews, the whole official narrative of the Stanford Prison Experiment just began to crumble. And the case against it? It's built on a mountain of evidence that was hiding in plain sight for decades.
And here it is. This is the bombshell, the smoking gun. When researchers finally got a hold of audio recordings from the experiment, they discovered that the guards weren't just spontaneously becoming cruel. Zimbardo and his team were actively coaching them. They were pushing them to be tougher, even giving them ideas for how to harass the prisoners. So it wasn't a natural result of the situation at all. It was actively encouraged by the experimenters themselves.
So yeah, from a scientific standpoint, this thing was a complete and utter mess. You have what are called demand characteristics. That's when people in a study just act the way they think the researchers want them to act. You have extreme bias from the experimenter, Zimbardo. There was no control group to compare anything to. And like we talked about, the people who signed up might not have been a random sample in the first place. Scientifically, it just doesn't hold up.
So that begs a pretty big question, right? If the experiment was this deeply flawed, how on earth did it become one of the most famous stories in psychology? How did such bad science create such a powerful and lasting myth?
Well, probably the best way to think about it is not as science at all, but as something called scientific theater. It's like a powerful stage play that's designed to create a dramatic result and tell a really compelling story. It was never an objective search for the truth. It was a performance designed to prove a point.
And that's exactly why this matters. The story was just too good, too simple, too shocking to question, and so it got repeated. It ended up in textbooks, in movies, in classrooms for 50 years, shaping how millions of us think about good and evil, all based on evidence that was, at its core, completely unsound.
So I'll leave you with this question to think about. It's one thing to point out bad science, but it's a lot harder to let go of a really powerful story. Why are we so drawn to these simple explanations for really complex things like evil? And what does our ongoing fascination with the Stanford Prison Experiment really say about us?